I'll tell you something right now. Boston is the oldest argument in America. A city that invented the country, spent 3 centuries insisting everyone remember that, and somehow also invented the telephone, the subway, and the greatest sports dynasty the modern era has ever produced. This is the place where the American experiment actually started, and it has never once let you forget it. Number 25. Boston was founded on a stolen peninsula. The Puritans who settled Boston in 1630 purchased the Shawmut Peninsula from a single English settler named William Blackstone, who had already bought it from the Massachusetts people who had lived on it for thousands of years, which is the kind of real estate transaction that raises questions that the 17th century was not particularly interested in answering. The peninsula was nearly an island, connected to the mainland by a thin strip of land called the Neck, surrounded by harbor on 3 sides, and so well positioned for defense and trade that the Puritans immediately understood they had found the right place to build the city they believed God had specifically requested. The geography of Boston Harbor, deep enough for large ships and sheltered enough to operate year-round, made it the commercial engine of colonial America within a generation and the wealthiest port on the continent within 2. Number 24. Paul Revere's ride was mostly wrong. Everyone knows the story. Longfellow wrote it in 1861, American schoolchildren have memorized it ever since, and approximately none of the famous details are accurate. Revere did not ride alone. William Dawes rode a different route simultaneously, and Samuel Prescott joined them midway and was actually the only one who completed the journey to Concord, because Revere was captured by a British patrol and briefly detained. The warning was not "the British are coming." Everyone in Massachusetts was technically British, and the message was about regulars, meaning the Crown's military forces. The geography of the ride, from Charlestown through Lexington toward Concord through the dark Massachusetts countryside in April of 1775, was real. The urgency was real, and the outcome was real. Longfellow just needed a better poem more than he needed strict accuracy, and American mythology obliged. Number 23. Harvard is older than the United States itself. The oldest university in America was founded in 1636, a mere 6 years after Boston itself, when the Massachusetts Bay Colony established a college to train Puritan ministers and ensure, in the words of the founding document, that literacy not be buried with the generation that had established the settlement. John Harvard, a young minister who died of tuberculosis in 1638, left half his estate and his entire library to the college, and the college named itself after him in gratitude, making him the only person in American history whose name became more famous after he died, broke at 29 than it would have been had he lived. Harvard has since produced 8 American presidents, more Nobel laureates than most countries, and a level of institutional self-regard that is either completely justified or completely insufferable, depending on whether you went there. Number 22. The Big Dig cost 10 times its estimate. The Central Artery/Tunnel project, universally known as the Big Dig, was the most expensive highway project in American history, burying a 6-lane elevated highway underground through the heart of downtown Boston, at a final cost of approximately $24 billion against an original estimate of $2.6 billion, which is a cost overrun so spectacular it became a case study in every public administration program in the country. The project took 15 years to complete, ran over budget every single year, leaked water into the tunnels almost immediately upon completion, and killed 1 person when a ceiling panel collapsed in 2006. What it produced was also genuinely transformative: a reconnected waterfront, the Rose Kennedy Greenway where the elevated highway used to cast shadows, and a downtown that for the first time in 50 years could see its own harbor. Boston argues about whether it was worth it with the passion of a city that knows the answer is yes, and resents having to admit it. Number 21. Boston's accent is a distinct linguistic phenomenon. The Boston accent, the dropped R's, the broad A's, the specific transformation of the word car into something that sounds like it should be spelled ka, is one of the most recognizable regional accents in the United States and one of the most studied by linguists, who classify it as a non-rhotic dialect influenced by 18th century British speech patterns that Boston preserved after Britain itself moved on. The accent is not uniform across the city. It is strongest in working-class neighborhoods like Southie and Dorchester, and softer in Brookline and Cambridge, and it functions as a class marker and a tribal identifier simultaneously. Attempting the Boston accent if you are not from Boston is considered an act of significant social aggression, and the city will let you know. Number 20. Fenway Park is baseball's most beloved ruin. Fenway Park opened in 1912, the same week the Titanic sank, a coincidence that Boston fans consider either cosmically significant or deeply irrelevant depending on what the Red Sox are doing in September. And it is the oldest Major League Baseball stadium currently in use, a creaking, beloved, structurally improbable facility with a 37-foot left field wall called the Green Monster that was built to stop cheap home runs and became the most iconic feature in American sports. The park holds only 37,755 people, making it among the smallest in the league, which means tickets are expensive, sightlines are occasionally medieval, and the experience of being there is irreplaceable in a way that every modern stadium with its club seats and food courts and adequate legroom has never come close to replicating. Boston had the chance to replace Fenway multiple times and declined, which is either sentimental or correct, and in this case, those are the same thing. Number 19. The Freedom Trail connects 16 historic sites. Boston's Freedom Trail is a 2.5-mile walking route marked by a red line of bricks through downtown, connecting 16 sites of Revolutionary War history: Paul Revere's house, the Old North Church, the site of the Boston Massacre, the Granary Burying Ground where Sam Adams and John Hancock are buried, in a concentration of preserved history that exists nowhere else in the country with this density. The trail was conceived in 1951 by a journalist named William Schofield, who suggested that Boston mark its historic sites so visitors could find them without getting lost in the city's infamously incomprehensible street grid, a problem that persists today regardless of the trail. Walking it in sequence is a 2-hour argument with American mythology, during which you realize that the people who started this country were younger, angrier, and considerably more willing to commit property destruction than the statues make them look. Number 18. Boston's street grid was designed by cows. The core of downtown Boston's street pattern, the tangle of narrow, one-way, frequently renamed streets that has disoriented visitors and infuriated drivers for 4 centuries, is largely derived from the cow paths, property lines, and shoreline contours of the original Shawmut Peninsula, which were never meaningfully rationalized into a grid because Boston grew too fast and argued too much to ever agree on how to reorganize itself. The city was also built on 3 hills that were systematically removed throughout the 19th century, the dirt used to fill the tidal flats and expand the peninsula, which means the streets curve around hills that no longer exist. GPS has improved the situation. It has not solved it. Number 17. The Boston Marathon is the world's oldest. The Boston Marathon has been run annually since 1897, making it the oldest annual marathon in the world. A 26.2-mile course from Hopkinton to Boylston Street that every April brings 500,000 spectators to the sidewalks of 8 cities and towns and a field of tens of thousands of runners who qualified for the privilege of suffering publicly. Patriots' Day, the Massachusetts holiday commemorating the battles of Lexington and Concord, is the race's official occasion, and Boston treats it with the seriousness of a civic sacrament. The bombings of April 15, 2013, which killed 3 people and injured hundreds near the finish line on Boylston Street, produced a grief and a defiance in equal measure. The phrase "Boston Strong" emerged within hours, and the following year's race drew the largest field in the event's history, which is the most Boston possible response to an attempt to take something from Boston. Number 16. John F. Kennedy was entirely a Boston product. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born in Brookline in 1917, educated at Harvard, and represented a Boston congressional district before becoming the first Catholic president of the United States in 1961, carrying with him the particular Boston Irish Catholic political identity that his grandfather Honey Fitz, a former mayor of Boston, had spent a lifetime constructing. The Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum in Dorchester, designed by I.M. Pei on a dramatic site above Boston Harbor, is one of the finest presidential libraries in the country and frames Kennedy's presidency with the particular light that Boston projects onto its most successful exports: pride, ownership, and the faint suggestion that the rest of the country received something it could not have produced on its own. Number 15. Beacon Hill looks exactly as it should. Beacon Hill, the federal-style brick row houses, the gaslit streets, the steep lanes running down to the Charles River, is one of the best-preserved 19th-century urban neighborhoods in the United States, a 50-acre district that has looked essentially the same since the 1820s because Boston's preservation instincts and Beacon Hill's real estate values converged early and have never diverged. The Massachusetts State House, topped by a dome originally covered in wood shingles and later in gold leaf, sits at the top of the hill above a neighborhood where the concentration of old money, old families, and old opinion about the correct way to do things reaches its purest expression. Beacon Hill is what people who have never been to Boston imagine Boston looks like, and for once, the imagination is correct. Number 14. The tea dumped here changed everything. On the night of December 16, 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of East India Company tea, worth about $1.7 million in today's money, into the water in a coordinated act of political theater so precisely executed and so deliberately provocative that the British Parliament passed 4 punitive acts in response, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, which produced the First Continental Congress, which produced the Second Continental Congress, which produced the Declaration of Independence. The Boston Tea Party was not an accident or a spontaneous uprising. It was a planned operation that Sam Adams and his network organized with the specific intent of forcing a confrontation they believed was inevitable anyway. The geography of Griffin's Wharf, where the ships were docked, no longer exists. It was filled in during the 19th century and is now a block of commercial real estate, which Boston considers an acceptable trade-off. Number 13. Boston built America's first public school. Boston Latin School, founded in 1635, 1 year before Harvard, is the oldest public school in the United States, established by the Puritan community on the principle that education was a civic obligation rather than a private luxury, a position that New England exported to the rest of the country with missionary intensity over the following 2 centuries. Benjamin Franklin attended Boston Latin, left without graduating, became the most famous man in colonial America, and donated 50 pounds to the school in his will, which is a complicated way of making peace with dropping out. The American public education system, the belief that a democracy requires an educated citizenry and that the government is responsible for providing the education, traces a direct line back to a school in downtown Boston that is still operating, still selective, and still producing people who know about it. Number 12. The Charles River separates 2 distinct worlds. The Charles River, running 80 miles from Hopkinton to Boston Harbor, forms the boundary between Boston and Cambridge, and by extension between the working-class political city and the university intellectual city, between old Boston money and new Cambridge ideas, between the people who run things and the people who think about how things should be run. The Esplanade along the Boston side hosts the Boston Pops on the 4th of July in a concert that draws hundreds of thousands of people to hear the 1812 overture with actual cannons, which is either magnificent or excessive, and Bostonians do not recognize a meaningful distinction between those 2 things. The river is cleaner now than it has been since the Industrial Revolution, a result of 30 years of environmental effort that Boston public officials cite with a pride that is completely deserved. Number 11. Boston's sports dynasty defies statistical explanation. Between 2001 and 2019, Boston's 4 major professional sports teams, the Patriots, Red Sox, Celtics, and Bruins, won 12 combined championships in a concentration of success that sports statisticians describe as either extraordinary luck, exceptional management, or evidence of something they don't have a category for. The Patriots won 6 Super Bowls in that period under Bill Belichick and Tom Brady, a partnership so dominant that the NFL spent 15 years arguing about whether their methods were ethical before the results forced the conversation in other directions. The Red Sox ended an 86-year World Series drought in 2004 in a manner so cinematically improbable, coming back from 3 games down against the Yankees, that Red Sox fans still describe it with the reverence normally reserved for religious experiences rather than baseball games. Boston is insufferable about this and has earned the right to be. Number 10. Chinatown survived despite everything against it. Boston's Chinatown, the 3rd largest in the United States, has survived the construction of the Massachusetts Turnpike through its northern edge, the demolition of the West End neighborhood that once buffered it, the adult entertainment district that surrounded it for decades, and the Big Dig construction that bordered it for 15 years, contracting from a neighborhood that once covered many blocks to a dense, vital, compressed community that operates with the tenacity of a place that has been told repeatedly it would not survive and has chosen not to process that information. The community's origins in the 19th century Chinese immigration that built the Transcontinental Railroad produced a Boston neighborhood that has held its ground through every urban renewal project the city attempted to run through it, and is now surrounded by luxury development that is learning to coexist with a community that has been there considerably longer. Number 9. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone here. On March 10, 1876, Alexander Graham Bell, a Scottish immigrant teaching deaf students at Boston University, transmitted the first intelligible telephone message from his lab on Court Street in Boston to his assistant Thomas Watson in the next room, saying words that Watson wrote down in his notebook and that Bell spent the rest of his life slightly embarrassed about because, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you," is not the most historically dignified first sentence to transmit across a revolutionary technology. The geography of Boston in the 1870s, a city with an active scientific community, university infrastructure, and investors wealthy enough to fund experimental technology, created the conditions for an invention that restructured human communication within a decade of its creation. Number 8. Roxbury and Dorchester built modern Boston. The neighborhoods of Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan, the majority Black and majority immigrant communities of inner Boston that have absorbed every wave of the city's demographic change since the post-war migration of African Americans from the South and have received a fraction of the city's investment in return, are where the actual daily life of Boston has been lived for 70 years. The busing crisis of 1974, when federal judge Arthur Garrity ordered the desegregation of Boston's public schools and white neighborhoods, responded with violence that was broadcast nationally and permanently complicated Boston's self-image as the cradle of liberty, happened here and in South Boston simultaneously. Two working-class communities weaponized against each other by a school system that had systematically underfunded both. The neighborhoods rebuilt. The reckoning is ongoing. Number 7. Boston runs on universities and hospitals. Greater Boston contains over 60 colleges and universities: MIT, Harvard, Boston University, Tufts, Northeastern, Boston College, and dozens more, producing a concentration of students, researchers, and faculty that makes the Boston economy structurally unlike any other American city its size. The medical complex anchored by Massachusetts General Hospital, Brigham and Women's, Dana-Farber, and the Harvard Medical School campus in Longwood is the most research-intensive medical district in the world, generating more NIH funding and more pharmaceutical and biotech development than any comparable geography on Earth. The geography of Boston, a relatively small, dense city that built world-class institutions rather than sprawling industrial capacity, created an economy that runs on ideas in a way that turns out to be quite durable when the factories close and the shipping routes move. Number 6. Faneuil Hall has never stopped being political. Faneuil Hall, the market building and meeting hall given to Boston in 1742 by merchant Peter Faneuil, hosted the town meetings where Boston's revolutionary anger was organized, articulated, and aimed at the British government, earning it the nickname the Cradle of Liberty, which Daniel Webster gave it and which Boston has never once stopped using in any promotional context where it fits. The hall is still a functioning civic venue, still hosts public meetings and political debates, and is surrounded by the Quincy Market complex that was restored in the 1970s and now operates as a tourist destination so thoroughly that it has somewhat obscured the building at its center where American democracy learned to argue. The geography of Faneuil Hall, at the commercial heart of colonial Boston, accessible to merchants, sailors, tradespeople, and agitators simultaneously, made it the natural place for a city to decide what it believed. Number 5. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum was robbed spectacularly. On March 18, 1990, two men dressed as Boston police officers knocked on the door of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum at 1:24 in the morning, gained entry, handcuffed the guards to pipes in the basement, and spent 81 minutes removing 13 works of art, including Vermeer's The Concert, 3 Rembrandts, and 5 Degas drawings, valued at over $500 million, making it the largest art theft in history. The frames still hang empty on the museum walls, Gardner's will having specified that the collection never be rearranged, and the FBI has described the case as the most significant unsolved art theft in the world. The museum itself, Gardner's recreation of a Venetian palace, built around a courtyard garden and filled with her idiosyncratic collection, is one of the most extraordinary museums in America, regardless of what is missing, which makes the missing pieces more painful rather than less. Number 4. Boston's neighborhoods are fiercely distinct. South Boston and the North End and Charlestown and Jamaica Plain and East Boston are not just geographic divisions. They are distinct cultural and social universes, each with its own accent gradations, its own political loyalties, its own relationship to the rest of the city, and its own firm opinion about what constitutes an acceptable reason to leave. The North End, Boston's Italian neighborhood, has been an Italian neighborhood since the early 20th century and operates with the self-sufficiency of a community that does not require outside acknowledgement to know what it is. East Boston, separated from the city by the harbor and accessible by tunnel or ferry, has been the landing point for immigrant communities since the Irish arrived in the 1840s and is currently the most Latino neighborhood in the city, continuing a pattern of cultural succession that is the actual history of Boston neighborhoods beneath the historical markers. The city works because the neighborhoods work, and the neighborhoods work because nobody has ever entirely convinced them they are the same place. Number 3. The Boston Brahmins shaped American culture quietly. The old Protestant families of Boston, the Cabots, the Lowells, the Adamses, the Lodges, constituted an aristocracy in a country that officially had none, running the banks, the universities, the publishing houses, and the cultural institutions of New England for a century and a half, with a self-assurance that Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. captured when he wrote that Boston was the hub of the solar system, a sentiment that Bostonians repeated so often it became hub of the universe, which is what the city is still called in local shorthand. The Boston Brahmin class also produced the Harvard-educated reformers who led the abolition movement, founded the Atlantic Monthly, built the Museum of Fine Arts, and funded the institutions that made Boston's cultural infrastructure the most robust in the country outside New York. They were often wrong, frequently insufferable, and genuinely formative, which is a combination that leaves a complicated legacy. Number 2. The massacre wasn't quite a massacre. On the night of March 5, 1770, a crowd of Boston colonists, throwing ice, oyster shells, and taunts at a small group of British soldiers guarding the Custom House, provoked a chaotic confrontation that ended with the soldiers firing into the crowd and killing 5 people. The first of them, a mixed-race man named Crispus Attucks, who became the first person killed in the events leading to the American Revolution. Paul Revere's engraving of the event, depicting the soldiers in a disciplined firing line executing peaceful citizens, produced and distributed within weeks, was propaganda of the highest effectiveness, and Sam Adams understood immediately that he had been handed the narrative that would unify colonial resistance. The soldiers were arrested, tried for murder, and defended by John Adams, who secured acquittals for most of them on the grounds that the mob had provoked the response, a defense that Adams considered his most important professional act, and that Boston has never quite finished arguing about, which is exactly as it should be. Number 1. Boston is America's argument with itself. The final and most defining fact about Boston is that this city contains, within its 48 square miles, both the ideals that America was founded on and the persistent, documented failure to live up to them. The school that educated the revolutionaries and the school buses that required police escorts through rock-throwing crowds. The cradle of liberty and the last major American city to integrate its police department. The city that produced the Declaration of Independence's intellectual architecture, and the city that enforced some of the most rigid racial and ethnic boundaries in the urban north. Boston does not resolve this contradiction. It lives inside it, loudly, every day, in a city small enough that the distance between Faneuil Hall and the neighborhoods that were excluded from its promises has always been measurable in walking minutes. The geography of Boston, compressed, dense, historically layered, incapable of hiding from itself, created a city that is the most American of cities precisely because it contains the full argument, not just the inspiring parts, and has never been able to pretend otherwise. Now that you know these 25 facts about Boston, drop your favorite in the comments and tell us, is Boston America's most historic city or just its most historically confident one? We want to know what you think. Your comments help us make every video better. And don't forget to subscribe and give it a like so we can keep exploring the hidden stories of every American city together. See you in the next one.